The moment Lachlan dropped his protein shaker on the boardroom table, leaned back in his chair like he owned the Southern Alps, and said, "What this team needs is radical velocity." I knew exactly where this was heading. Nowhere good, nowhere fast. Just sideways, loudly, with a lot of unnecessary slides. I'd spent the previous 4 hours untangling a supplier dispute that would have cost us 3 weeks of production timeline. No fanfare, no Slack announcement. Just me, 2 cold cups of tea, and a spreadsheet that looked like it had survived a natural disaster. Fixed, quietly, the way I do everything. Meanwhile, Lachlan, 26 years old, fresh off a leadership intensive in Queenstown that was definitely more hot tub than whiteboard, had just been handed the title of Head of Innovation Strategy. His father, our managing director, had announced it in a company-wide email with 3 exclamation marks and a photo that looked like a LinkedIn headshot taken by someone who just discovered portrait mode. I should introduce myself. My name is Priya Nair. I'm 31. I've been the operations and compliance lead at Hartwell Building Solutions for 5 years, which in this industry is roughly equivalent to 2 lifetimes. We're a mid-sized construction supply company based in Auckland, which means we live and die by supplier contracts, council compliance schedules, and the kind of regulatory documentation that makes most people's eyes glaze over like a bad pavlova. I love it. I'm good at it. I don't need a title that has the word velocity in it to prove that. What I do need, apparently, is the ability to smile politely while someone who thinks a Gantt chart is a type of cheese dismantles 5 years of operational infrastructure in the name of disruption. Lachlan's first week as head of innovation strategy produced 3 things. A new internal messaging channel called The Hive that no one used, a suggestion that we replace our compliance tracking system with something more intuitive and vibe-based, and a very long email to the entire team about flattening the energy architecture of our output cadence. I printed that email, read it 4 times, and still don't know what it means. I didn't fight it directly. That's not how I operate. I raised concerns in the right rooms, through the right channels, in writing. I documented everything. That habit started year 1, when I realized that in this industry, the paper trail is the only thing standing between you and a very expensive problem. Every time I flagged something, I forwarded a copy to my personal email, not out of paranoia, just out of professional common sense, the kind Lachlan had apparently never been introduced to. By month 2 of his tenure, the cracks were showing in the plaster. Supplier invoices were being routed through a new approval system. He'd introduced a third-party app his mate had built, which kept timing out above a certain dollar threshold. Procurement was quietly panicking. Our health and safety documentation for 3 active project sites had fallen behind because Lachlan had streamlined the reporting workflow without realizing that the forms had legally mandated submission windows. I fixed it after hours on a Tuesday, said nothing, and went home to eat leftover pasta and watch a program about penguins. The thing about doing invisible work is that it keeps the machine running so smoothly that the people who've never touched the gears assume there are no gears. Lachlan genuinely believed the compliance calendar ran itself. He thought the supplier relationships I'd spent years building were just contractual formalities. He walked past my desk one afternoon and said, loudly enough for 2 junior staff to hear, "We need people who build, not just maintain." He was looking directly at me. I looked up from my screen. "The Briarwood site submission is due Friday," I said. "If it misses the window, we lose the council pre-approval, and the whole project pushes out by 6 weeks." He nodded like he understood. He didn't, but he nodded. The next morning, he sent me a calendar invite titled Role Alignment Correro. I accepted it. I also quietly pulled up my employment contract, the company's funding agreement with our primary investor, and a particular clause I'd flagged internally 8 months earlier when the last round of financing came through. I'd even sent a memo to the managing director at the time, Lachlan's father, noting that the clause required specific language around the designated compliance officer and that any structural change to that role would need to be formally registered with both the board and the investment partnership before the next milestone review. The memo had been read. I could see the little tick in the system. No reply had ever come. That Friday, 2 things happened. The Briarwood submission went in on time, because I submitted it, And Lachlan's role alignment, Kororo, turned out to be a lot more than a chat. I arrived 3 minutes early. He was already there, sitting at the head of the small meeting room with his laptop open and the kind of expression people wear when they've rehearsed something and are hoping it comes out right. He started with, "Look, we really value what you bring," which is the corporate equivalent of, "I'm not racist," but, and then moved into a 10-minute explanation of how the company needed to evolve its operational thinking toward more agile, externally facing strategy work. He used the word pivot 6 times. I counted. Then he said, "We're transitioning your role into a more consultative capacity." I asked what that meant in practical terms. He said it meant my day-to-day operational responsibilities would be redistributed to the wider team, and that I'd be available on an as-needed basis going forward. I asked if this was a redundancy. He said, "It's more of a role evolution." I asked for that in writing. He blinked, said HR would be in touch, then stood up, which I understood to be his signal that the meeting was over. I walked back to my desk, sat down, opened my laptop, pulled up the investment agreement, the one I had a legitimate copy of because I'd been the one to review and file it. Found clause 11.4. Read it one more time, even though I already knew every word. All milestone-linked disbursements are contingent upon verified compliance oversight by the designated Compliance and Operations Lead, as named in Schedule B of this agreement. Any change to the designated officer must be submitted in writing to the board and acknowledged by the lead investment partner no fewer than 15 business days prior to the relevant milestone review. My name was in Schedule B, not my title, not whoever holds the role. My name, Priya Nair. I forwarded the agreement to my personal email, added it to the folder I'd been quietly building for 8 months. Then I stood up, collected the small succulent I'd been nursing through 2 office moves and a very aggressive air conditioning system, tucked it under my arm, and left. No drama, no speech. I nodded at the receptionist on the way out, held the lift for someone from accounts who was carrying a box of biscuits, and didn't even look up. In the car park, I sat in my car for a while, with the engine off. Listened to the wind. Auckland in late autumn does this thing where the light goes golden and flat all at once, like the sky can't quite decide what it wants to be. I watched it for a few minutes. Then I drove home. I want to be clear about what I did not do over the next week. I did not post anything on LinkedIn. I did not text my contacts asking for inside information. I did not cry, though I did eat an unreasonable amount of toast. What I did do was read. I reread the funding agreement. I reread my employment contract. I contacted an employment lawyer, a very calm woman named Josephine, who had the energy of someone who had seen every possible version of workplace nonsense and was no longer surprised by any of it. And I laid out the situation. In plain terms, she asked if I had documentation of the verbal termination. I said I had the calendar invite, the meeting notes I'd typed up immediately afterward, and the fact that my access credentials had been quietly downgraded 3 days later, which I'd screenshotted the moment I noticed. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Don't sign anything. Don't respond to anything from HR without running it past me first. And don't reach out to the company to offer assistance." I asked why not. She said, "Because you don't need to. Let the clock run." So I did. I kept my personal email open. I watched, because some of my project distribution lists had never been updated to remove me, and the notifications kept arriving, like little windows into a building I no longer worked in. What I saw over the following 10 days was the operational equivalent of someone removing a load-bearing wall and then being surprised when the ceiling starts making sounds. The first sign was an email thread I was still CC'd on, never removed. Probably because no one knew I was on it, from the procurement manager to Lachlan, asking how to process a supplier invoice above the $50,000 threshold, given that the new approval system kept failing. Lachlan replied with a screenshot of the app's frequently asked questions page. The procurement manager replied with a 2-word response, "I won't repeat here." The second sign was a message forwarded to me by someone I'll call a quiet ally, a contracts administrator named Bex, who had been with the company longer than anyone, and communicated exclusively through forwarded emails and raised eyebrows. She sent me a screenshot without comment. It was a message from the health and safety coordinator saying the quarterly site audit documentation was due in 4 days, and she couldn't locate the master compliance folder because it had been migrated to Lachlan's new project, management system, and no one had the access. Permissions. The third sign was Lachlan's LinkedIn post. Excited to be reshaping the operational DNA of our team with fresh thinking and bold new frameworks. 47 likes. 11 comments, all from people who appeared to also collect motivational quotes as a hobby. The comment I noticed most, though, was from the company's primary investor. Not a like, not a comment, just a direct message to Lachlan's company email, which I knew about because the thread eventually found its way to me through a slightly panicked forwarded chain, asking when the Q4 milestone compliance verification would be submitted. As the disbursement window was approaching, Lachlan had apparently responded by saying everything was tracking well. I'm told the investor's office replied within 20 minutes, asking for the signed verification document specifically. I'm told that by the time someone thought to search for who was responsible for producing that document, 3 different people in 3 different departments had pointed to the same name. Mine. Not the compliance function, not the operations team. Me by name, in Schedule B, in the agreement that had been signed and filed, and apparently not reread by anyone in leadership since the ink dried. The call started on a Wednesday. First from an unknown number, I let it go to voicemail, then from a number I recognized as the company's main line, then a text from Bex. They've just realized. It's not good. I didn't respond. I made a second cup of tea and read a novel about a lighthouse keeper. Thursday brought an email from the company's legal team. The subject line was documentation query urgent, and the body was written in that particular strain of corporate language that tries very hard to sound casual while clearly having been reviewed by 3 people before sending. It asked whether I might be able to assist with finalizing some compliance documentation in line with our upcoming milestone review, and referenced a PDF attachment. The attachment was a verification form, predated, with my name already typed into the signature field. I opened it, read it, closed it, marked the email unread, and placed it in a folder labeled Josephine. I forwarded it to my lawyer within the hour. She called me back in 15 minutes. Her exact words were, "Do not touch that document. Do not reply to that email. And I need you to find a time tomorrow morning because we have some decisions to make." What I didn't know yet, but would piece together later from a combination of Bex's forwarded messages and a very candid phone call from the company's CFO, who I'd always respected and who was clearly ringing me from her personal phone, was that the investor's office had by that point contacted the board directly, not through the managing director, not through Lachlan, directly to the independent board members, 2 of whom had apparently not been aware that the operational compliance lead had been role-evolved out of the building without any formal process, documentation, or notification to the investment partnership. The CFO told me, choosing her words carefully, that there was a degree of concern at board level about governance continuity. She paused, then said, more quietly, "Priya, I want you to know that not everyone here agreed with how this was handled." I thanked her. I didn't ask her for anything. I didn't make any promises. I just told her that I had documentation of everything and that I was working through the appropriate channels. After we hung up, I sat for a moment with the phone in my hand. Not triumphant, not angry. Somewhere in the vicinity of calm, which is the most honest word I have for the feeling you get when you've prepared well and the preparation turns out to matter. The emergency board meeting was called for a Friday morning at 7:30 a.m., a time that, as far as I'm concerned, communicates one thing clearly. Someone is frightened. You don't drag board members across Auckland at 7:30 on a Friday because things are going well. I wasn't invited, obviously, but I heard about it from 2 separate sources before the morning was out. What I understand happened in that room is this. The investor's representative, a woman who manages the partnership's New Zealand portfolio, and who, by all accounts, is not someone who enjoys having her time wasted, asked a series of very specific questions. When had the compliance lead's role been formally transitioned? When had the board been notified? When had the investment partnership received the required written notice under Clause 11.4? What was the name of the currently designated compliance officer for the purposes of the milestone verification? The managing director answered the first three questions with variations of, "We're working through the details." The fourth question produced silence. The investor's representative then said, clearly and without any apparent emotion, that the disbursement, $2.3 million, the Q4 milestone payment that the company had been counting on to fund 2 new project bids, could not be released until the compliance verification was properly executed by the named officer, and that any change to that designation required the formal process outlined in Clause 11.4, which had not been followed. Lachlan, I'm told, said something along the lines of, "Can't we just update the name in the document?" The investor's representative apparently looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "No." The managing director asked what the timeline for resolution looked like. She said it depended entirely on how quickly governance could be properly restored, and that in the meantime, the disbursement was paused. She then closed her folder, thanked the board for their time, and left. I heard the Lachlan had barely said another word for the rest of the meeting. That his father had sat very still, the way people sit when they're doing the maths on a decision they can no longer undo. On Saturday morning, I received an email from the investor's representative directly. Not through the company, not through a lawyer. Directly, to my personal email, from her work address. It was 4 sentences. She introduced herself, noted that she understood I had a solid working knowledge of the compliance framework underpinning the current funding agreement, and asked whether I would be open to a conversation about a potential consulting engagement. She said the terms would be flexible. I read it twice. Then I put my phone down and went for a walk along the waterfront, because it was a genuinely nice day, and I'd been spending too much time indoors. I want to be honest about how I felt in that moment. Not smug. I know that's what people expect, some kind of vindication. High arms in the air. I told you so energy. But it wasn't that. It was something quieter and more permanent. The feeling of having done your job well, for years, in good faith, and having that turn out to matter in a way that couldn't be ignored or rebranded or pivoted around. I'd never wanted Hartwell to fall over. I didn't want suppliers unpaid, or projects delayed, or junior staff caught in the crossfire of decisions made above their heads. I'd spent 5 years trying to prevent exactly that kind of mess. Walking away hadn't been a strategy. It had been the only thing left available to me after being told, politely and implicitly, and then less politely, that the work I did wasn't the kind of work they valued anymore. But I'd kept the documentation. I'd flagged the clause. I'd done everything right. And when the weight of that came back around, as it tends to do, eventually, when the paperwork is solid, it didn't feel like revenge. It felt like math. The following week moved quickly. Josephine and I exchanged the predated document back through legal channels with a very formal letter outlining, among other things, that a termination by verbal instruction, without written notice or proper process, combined with a document now attempting to retroactively confirm authority I no longer held, constituted grounds for a personal grievance claim under the Employment Relations Act. We made no threats. We simply noted the facts and their implications. I'm told the managing director read that letter in his office and didn't come out for 2 hours. The company's response came back measured and conciliatory, which is what happens when a lawyer has clearly been given custody of the keyboard. They acknowledged procedural failings in the transition of my role. They expressed interest in reaching a resolution. They used the phrase, regrettable miscommunication 4 times, which felt optimistic. Meanwhile, the investor's engagement went ahead. I accepted the consulting arrangement on terms I was satisfied with. My first brief was straightforward. Review the existing compliance framework, identify gaps created during the transition period, and recommend a path to restoring governance continuity in advance of the milestone review. I produced a clear report, filed the necessary documentation, and made sure my name in Schedule B was properly addressed through the correct formal channels. The milestone verification was submitted on time. The $2.3 million disbursement was released. I was not in the building when it happened. I was at a desk in a shared workspace in Parnell, with my succulent on the windowsill and a flat white from the place downstairs, watching the harbor go gray in the mid-morning light. Lachlan's title disappeared from the company website sometime in the 3rd week. No announcement, no farewell post on LinkedIn, just a small absence where his name had been. like a photo nail left in a wall after the picture comes down. I don't know exactly what conversations happened between the managing director and his son. I don't need to. What I know is that two of the suppliers who'd paused their contracts quietly resumed them once the documentation was back in order. I know that the health and safety compliance calendar was rebuilt from the archived folders that had always been exactly where I'd left them. I know that the employment matter was resolved through mediation, on terms that I'm not at liberty to disclose, but that I can say were not unfavorable. A week after the mediation closed, Bex texted me a single image, a photo of my old desk, cleared and clean, with a small post-it note stuck to the monitor. It just said, "They finally found the compliance folder." It was in the folder called Compliance. I sent back a single emoji. She sent back 3. There's something I've been thinking about since all of this settled. Something that felt important enough to sit with before I talked about it. We spend a lot of time, especially when we're starting out in our careers, trying to make our work visible, trying to be noticed, trying to make sure people know what we contribute and what we're capable of. That instinct isn't wrong. But there's another kind of visibility. The kind that lives not in presentations or titles or announcements, but in agreements, in documented processes, in the systems that keep things running when no one is watching. I never asked for credit for keeping the compliance calendar current, or for fixing the supplier dispute at 4 in the afternoon when no one asked me to. I did it because it needed doing, and I was the one who knew how. But I also wrote things down. I sent memos. I kept records, not because I was planning for something to go wrong, but because that's what it means to do the work properly. And when it mattered, when someone decided that the work I did was invisible and therefore removable, the evidence of it was right there, time-stamped and filed and waiting. Nobody can take from you what's already documented. Nobody can erase what's been properly recorded. And nobody, regardless of whose name is on the building or whose family they were born into, can simply wave away the infrastructure that holds an organization together just because they don't understand how it was built. I learned early that the quietest people in a room are often holding the most. The ones who don't raise their hand in every meeting, who don't need the recognition to do the work, who just get on with it and go home. That's not weakness, that's foundation. But foundation without record is just hope. Document the work, know your agreements. Understand your value clearly enough to be able to prove it when you're asked to. Lachlan learned what happens when you pull at something without knowing what it's attached to. That's a lesson no wellness retreat and no LinkedIn live session can teach you. You learn it the way most important things are learned, by watching the ceiling come down and realizing too late that you were the one who moved the wall. I'm not bitter about any of it. I'm genuinely not. I'm sitting here with a good contract, a desk with natural light, and the quiet satisfaction of someone who did the boring, important, unglamorous work for years, and then watched the proof of it speak louder than any title ever could. The succulent is doing brilliantly, by the way. Turns out it just needed better light. If you've ever been the person in the room who holds things together without anyone noticing, keep the records. Know your contracts. And don't let anyone convince you that invisible work is the same as unimportant work. The two couldn't be further apart.